Hello and welcome to the May 18th edition of the Cluster API Provider AWS Office Hours, the subproject of both SIG Cluster Lifecycle and Cluster API. Just a reminder, this meeting is recorded and will be posted up to YouTube later, and all of the Kubernetes community guidelines are in effect for the meeting. So in general, please be excellent to one another. All right, to start with today, we have Nadir with a heads up on the multi-tenancy proposal.
Yeah, so talked about it mentioned it last week. So please take a look. Try to include everyone's feedback as much as possible. So yeah, and we'll be working on it once it's merged. So good to get some eyes. It's quite long. I'm sorry.
All right, thanks, Nadir. Any questions or comments on that? Otherwise, please do take a look and provide feedback. All right, next up is...
Just great work, wanted to say. It's an awesome proposal.
Thank you. All right, next up is Seth, Subnet Cross AZ.
Yeah, I'm grabbing the link right now. In support of some of the EKS work, it looks like Richard Case is his name. Apologies. Has opened a PR to change the default subnetting that we do when creating a VPC. Before it was one AZ with one public and one private subnet, and it's going through like a more standard multi-AZ configuration with one public subnet and then a bunch of different private ones. So that's that PR. Take a look if it's interesting to your, relevant to your interests.
Awesome, thank you. I will definitely take a look later. I know there's some potential challenges, especially when looking at like backwards compatibility and that sort of thing. And I know I discussed it with, I think it was Ben Moss earlier, who had taken a stab there. So I'll definitely take a look and provide feedback there. It'd be great if we can move along in that manner as well, because that would also help out our more general kind of HA story around control planes as well. And on that note, it looks like we're back to you, Seth, for the first group topic.
Yeah, so we at New Relic have been doing some customer interviews with our customers who are users of CAPI and Kappa. And so these are these two topics are sort of both the learnings so far that we've had from that I wanted to just mostly share with y'all, but also check in if there's something I'm missing about. So a big one was that the 3 machine deployment to get 3 AZ thing was a rough spot for our customers. They would prefer to have machine deployments that know how to span across failure domains. I know that the failure domain support went into CAPI in V1 Alpha 3, but I don't know if there's like any work on the books or plans to turn that into something that Kappa does, or if there's more work upstream that needs to happen there.
So I think the first thing would be is we need to get general support in core cluster API, that it's a feature we want to support with machine deployments, or really machine sets, which would be the underlying implementation. However, I can give some of the background as to why we chose not to go that route by default in the past. And it mainly comes down to the implementation of persistent volumes, and those being tied to specific AZs. And you get into weird scaling conditions, and where do you scale up properly to handle those types of situations, and how do you handle scale down? And the choice to limit to a specific AZ was to kind of avoid having to build in all that complicated logic, and it becomes a higher level concern. There are also other potential kind of gotchas that you have around increased latency between the AZs, and having that by default, can create some weird behaviors that people may not expect in their applications. And having those tied to different machine deployments and machine sets made it more easier to also target, those specific nodes for deploying applications to when they're trying to, based on different labels that are applied to the different AZs and that sort of thing. That said, it's definitely a discussion that we need to have, because it's a request that's come up multiple times. And, if we can get agreement in the community that it's something that we want, the next step's going to be, how do we enable that safely, and try to avoid some of those issues when spanning AZs that you would have with the machine deployment.
Yeah, that's great. Those are great points. The thing that made me realize is that we have two discrete sets of customers. The ones that don't particularly care about, like, they don't use EBS volumes, and they don't particularly care about the latency pieces, and then the ones that really, really do. And like, I think for the ones that really, really do, like, I would feel pretty justified in saying, well, here's your 3 machine deployments. Now you have the control. I guess I wonder if there's some other sort of like an opt-in way for that other group to not have to not worry about that, because they see it as not their concern, right? We don't have like an experiment sort of section in Kappa yet, do we?
We do, and we do have the ability to enable feature gates based on certain things. However, we would need to work out on kind of a case-by-case basis, because I wouldn't think that we would want to replicate machine deployment and machine sets in this case, which would mean we'd have to expose some type of change in the data model, which kind of gets a little tricky with kind of the experiment idea right now, which is generally more around toggleable kind of features, like, you set a feature gate on the controller and enable this behavior by default or not, or, you enable controllers for different functionality. We haven't really broached the idea of adding a new field and only handling, the value of that field, on an experimental basis yet. So we probably need to figure out how we could possibly do that as an experiment, if we wanted to go that route, or if we wanted to kind of use the more kind of cautious approach and try to do it on, a non-experimental basis, based on, the data model changes needed.
I wonder, because the pattern that I observed in upstream Kubernetes was that they would introduce, like, init containers was an annotation before it was part of the pod's, spec. I wonder if there isn't a path there where we add stuff in annotations, and then if it sort of survives the experimental phase, it gets promoted into something else. I guess I could probably open up an issue more specifically about that, and we can think about design there.
Yeah, definitely. I know in the past we've generally avoided the annotations because they end up being, kind of, they become part of the API regardless, and you still have to provide certain guarantees around that. And if you're already doing that, you might as well go ahead and do it with the field anyway. But it's definitely an approach we can look at and do it in a more staged manner. And that would probably be more friendly to, the way that we have experiments kind of set up today. And with that, we're back to you again, Seth, for your next topic.
Yeah, so the other piece that we've been hearing from our customers a lot is that Amazon is somewhat wanton with their capacity and availability of scaling availability. I unfortunately don't have anything particularly actionable on this, but it is a pain point for our customers. They try to scale the machine deployment, and it scales. Cappy scales perfectly fine, and Kappa starts taking the best action it can, and often gets things like there are no more of that instance class available in that availability zone, or you've hit your vCPU limit for this account for this region, and these sorts of things. And the ways that we resolve those today are not particularly like, usually someone comes and asks us, the team that runs the Kepi stuff, and says, hey, I'm seeing this weird error, I don't know what to do. And it would be great, I guess, if we could give them more actionable guidance on what to do, is maybe what I want to say here.
Yeah, so I think one of the goals of the conditions work that is currently being sketched out is to help kind of surface these types of issues a little bit better. I don't think we've yet gotten to the point where we've started, more accurately defining the types of conditions that we wanted to surface and those types of things yet, especially on the infrastructure provider side. But I would expect that that would be kind of our first course of action. And then in addition to that, I'm hoping that we can start leveraging some of those conditions when they're defined to help better, expose some of that on the command line, whether it's with kubectl or with clusterctl as well, to kind of summarize some of that data and provide better, visibility. And then in addition to that, we should also be looking at how can we bubble up some of these conditions from, the infrastructure provider types all the way up through, the machine sets, the machine deployments, and potentially the cluster level, so that it's easier to kind of follow those breadcrumbs from a top-down approach versus having to, start from the bottom up, from the user level when they're trying to figure out why things aren't, functioning the way they intend to.
Yeah, that's really great. I hadn't put together the conditions and the surfacing of stuff like that yet, but that's a really great approach, I think, because that's you're exactly right about the following the breadcrumbs too. Is the other thing that we've heard is it's tough to do that, and like knowing where to look and which things to inspect and whatnot it takes some effort.
Yeah, you really do need to know the architecture now and know where things could potentially break down to start looking. And longer term, that shouldn't be the case. You should always be able to start with the cluster and follow breadcrumbs down as far as you need to be able to inspect further and get to kind of, for lack of a better word, kind of root cause of an issue. Now, beyond that, the other thing that I would say is we probably want to look at how we can better define which types of these errors we should treat as terminal versus recoverable. Because right now we default to the kind of recoverable use case, with the idea being that, if you're running into account limits, you can always reach out to Amazon, increase your limits, and you shouldn't necessarily need to, try to recreate things to kind of get things kind of back where you expect them to be. Maybe we need to reassess some of those, especially in light of like the Kube control plane resource existing now that can, you know, potentially attempt to do the retries for scaling at that level instead of, you know, keep retrying to create the same instance on the machine level. That, you know, we can probably start considering some more of these, you know, more terminal kind of conditions rather than, you know, retriable conditions. And that should help a little bit with some of the visibility as well, because, you know, at that point, the failure becomes more of a failure on the machine set and machine deployment or the Kube control plane versus, you know, being a issue on the machine that just continually retries.
Semi-related question. Was there something a while back about trying to surface bootstrapping errors as well? That's like a pretty big undertaking, if I remember correctly. I was just curious if that was a plan still. That might not be Kappa related though.
So it is and it isn't. It is in that it will affect some implementation on the AWS provider side, but it will also require work on the core cluster API side as well. And I see Nadir has his hand raised. Was it about this issue?
Yeah, I'm currently writing a doc on that. There's many different use cases and there's different ways to solve them. So I'm currently collecting them with a bunch of questions, that pointed questions that I want people to answer, because it strongly influences what direction we would take in terms of what we can provide for bootstrap failure detection. And there's differences across the cloud providers, and the assumption around one-way or two-way communication strongly affects what we can do. I'm going to get that done today, actually, so I'll email that around. And if there's use cases missing, add them. And I'm probably going to set up a meeting later this week, so I'll send it out to interested parties.
All right. Any other topics for today? I will add one thing. I saw, I can't remember whether it was Slack or email or somewhere as I was going through the fun little backlog that I have from being out for a little over a week, that Vince, oh, sorry, had a phone call interrupt. I saw that Vince had suggested that we might want to look at a new release to pull in some, to get some fixes that had landed out there. So I will probably start looking at cutting a new release within the next couple of days. So if there are any outstanding PRs that you would like to have in that next release, please go ahead and raise them so that we can make sure to get them in before getting that release cut. All right, and I see a question in chat around per cluster federated AWS account. Did you want to speak to that, Nadir?
Yeah, that's the proposal in the PSAs at the top. So just looking for people to say yes, no, comments. Once that's approved, we'll get working on it. So the main changes from previous discussions is that accounts are going to be cluster scoped, and copying exactly what Ingress Future Renext looks like is you would specify an allowed namespaces selector, and then that will allow you to say which namespaces are allowed to use the account such that you don't get privilege escalation.
Did that answer your question there, Deepak? All right. Any other topics before we move on to the issue triage? All right. And I just realized I haven't been sharing my screen. All right, so hopefully that's coming through now. So let's see, issues with no milestone. All right. Allow clusters to be created when naming starting with SG.
Yeah, that's a fun one. Because we create security groups with the cluster name, starting with the cluster name. If you actually call your cluster SG hyphen something, which happened because we have an individual whose initials are SG, so it's a reasonable enough request. They couldn't create the cluster. So I think there's two options here. One is we prefix all the security groups with cluster API or something, or we special case that when you actually just have SG hyphen. Yeah, so it's a decision to be made, but otherwise an easy fix.
So is this mainly because AWS tries to avoid naming that would conflict with like the
Security
ID creation? Fun. Do we need to worry about this with other resources as well, potentially?
Not that I know of. It is something I didn't know about in the back of my head from years back. But yeah, just funnily enough, someone managed to hit this recently.
Yeah. All right. I will put this one in 05X. What do you think about relative priority? Important soon, important long term?
Important long term? I don't think it's important. If you feel particularly strongly about preserving exactly the same security group ID names we have right now, I would put a comment. Otherwise, we'll probably just put a prefix to everything.
Yeah, I don't think I wouldn't expect there to be too much pushback over the naming of them as much, but you never know. So we'll definitely want to seek some feedback there. All right. Segfault when using additional security groups with filters. Oh.
Yeah, so the individual found we have no logic for supporting that part of the API when doing security groups. They've got some interesting questions about how do we continually reconcile that if the filter changes. So
yeah, and I think this comes to the fact that we created the types overly broadly. But I'm not sure there's much that we can do to address that, because I don't think we ever intended for security groups to be able to be searched by filter. But
yeah,
at the same time, it would be a breaking API change to change it before V1 Alpha 4 as well. So
yeah, which is why I initially suggested go ahead and do it, but then all their concerns are also correct.
yeah. All right, I'll circle back on that one a little bit later. All right, implement AWS machine pools using ASG. How are y'all feeling about this, Andrew and Seth? Is this something that is of interest to you all, or?
It is in that I think the implementation will be interesting to look at. I think from our perspective, we're interested in the spot fleet version of this. So like any kind of generic bits or reference implementation will help us get there. Seth who's looking more at the EKS style things. I'm curious how maybe we could get some use out of using ASGs, but yeah.
Yeah, because I don't think it's overly high on our priority list right now. So while I like the idea of implementing it longer term, I don't know that we're going to have resources to kind of put towards this in the short term. So I think I'm just going to put this next and long term for now.
It's kind of a big one, but would that be a help wanted situation?
Yes, I would say so. But definitely not a good first issue. All right. AWS cluster controller attempts to change immutable fields spec.control plane endpoint. So this is definitely kind of a use case that we haven't considered before.
But potentially should be supported through KCP by setting the field, maybe.
Yeah. Is this something that you could potentially take a deeper dive into, Nadir? Because I don't think this is something that we can easily triage.
Yeah, it's me, and then maybe it's documentation. Hopefully it is. Resolve it.
All right. And we have allow specifying internal subnets for control plane. And I think I already saw, was there a PR that I saw that was related to this as well, or just the issue?
I think Richard there is using Terraform to spin up the subnets. So I think Matt might be right. I'm not sure though.
Yeah, I was just reading through the code and how managed versus unmanaged utilizes those fields when it assigns them.
Yeah. I know there was additional work that we were talking about doing on the detection side where we wanted to stop kind of auto detecting all subnets that were part of a VPC when specifying existing infrastructure as well. So I'll go ahead and just leave that out there because we have that additional work out there and we can double back to it as needed. All right, and then the AWS machine template mutable fields have no path to being reconciled when modified. Is there more has there been any additional work towards this, Andrew or Seth?
Yeah, we talked about the RFE 3020 there was discussed at the Cluster API meeting last week. And it sounds like there was at least enough for lazy consensus around having Cappy do the linking so that it's easier to reconcile in Kappa. But I haven't had the time to form that into a PR.
All right, and do you think this would require any kind of like API level breaking changes, or is it potentially something that we could address as part of the 0.5.x series?
It would all be field additions, whether it's on the AWS machine or the machine itself. So I don't think it would be breaking.
All right, I'll go ahead and put it in 0.5x then.
Having said that, I just now, I don't know how we want to consider when you upgrade the control plane components, you might find, or the Cappy components, you might find a bunch of things changing in your cluster all of a sudden. That might be a breaking change.
Yeah, I think that's something that we can consider at the, you know, as part of the implementation as well. So I wouldn't necessarily consider it blocking from 0.5x milestone right now. And then what about kind of priority on this? Where do y'all see this landing? Soon, long term?
Now that we sort of understand how to do it, I would say soon.
All right. Sounds good. And we can always adjust if it ends up needing a breaking change, the milestone and all that if needed. So hopefully that leaves us just the filters one and the immutable spec control plane endpoint issue that we're going to follow up on. Any other topics, questions, comments, concerns? If not, thank you all very much. We will see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.